Chapter 6, Cell Communication. In this chapter, we describe the four main processes essential for cells to communicate. We provide an overview of how cell communication is regulated, and we cite evidence for some evolutionary relationship in cell communication. In these next few slides, I'm just going to give an overview of why cells communicate and why do scientists study cell communication. So why do cells communicate? Well, cells are always communicating in order to maintain homeostasis. Cells also communicate for mating purposes. Cells within plants may communicate in order to signal nearby infections. Cells within animals will communicate to regulate concentration of certain chemicals. In terms of communication, organisms communicate with members of their own species by secreting chemical signals. In the example shown on the left, organisms can communicate with members of their own species by secreting chemical signals. So bacteria can regulate activities through mechanisms of quorum sensing. So quorum sensing involves bacterial cells communicating with each other by releasing, sensing, and responding to small chemicals or small chemicals that they secrete. And so what ends up eventually happening is that these bacteria are able to form a biofilm on a prosthetic device as a result of communicating with each other to colonize this particular device. In example B, when food is scarce, amoeba-like slime mold will communicate with each other to aggregate. Another example of communication with cells or among cells or organisms of different species can communicate with one another by chemical signals. So if you look at the image on the right, stained in blue are the bacterial cells that are forming a biofilm. And if you would recall from what I said earlier, when bacteria want to form this biofilm, they have to secrete chemical signals. Well, these chemical signals will attract spores of green seaweed pictured in red or pink here. So organisms can communicate with different species through chemical signals. And finally, just to kind of recap from what I said earlier, these molecules within animal cells, within your plant cells, within cells from different organisms, these cells need to communicate in order to maintain homeostasis. So why might cells want to study why might scientists want to study cell signaling? So cell signaling is important for normal cell growth, for immunity, for maintenance of homeostatic processes within the body. And so any errors in cellular information processing can result in cancer, autoimmunity, and diabetes. And so an example or animation shown on the right, you have cancer cells that are going to produce signals to make blood vessels grow. And this is what will allow the tumor cells to become larger. So if we understand cell signaling, certain diseases such as cancer may be treated effectively. Additionally, if we understand how cells communicate with each other, artificial tissues may be created. So in the example shown here, a new mouse was implanted with a wire in the shape of an ear, and this wire was seeded with cartilage cells, okay? And so as you can see, after so many days, these cells were able to take on the shape of that wire that was implanted into the nude mouse. So we were able to generate a artificial ear, the artificial shape of an ear. We start by describing the four main processes essential for cells to communicate. To start, cell signaling is defined as the mechanisms by which cells communicate with one another. This animation is here to show the four main processes that are involved in communication between cells. We will start by breaking this animation down and defining each of the four main processes shown here: signal transmission, reception, signal transduction, and responding. So we're starting at the top of the animation, and then we're going to work our way down to the cell response. So signal transmission is involving chemical signaling and how the cell will synthesize and release these signaling molecules. If target cells are not nearby, the signal has to be transported to the target cell. So in the image here, this is just the animation showing a cell releasing signaling molecules, and these will travel to the target cell. And this is a specific example taken from this website where it's showing a signaling molecule in tan that's responsible for binding to a T cell. So this is an immune cell, and releasing cytotoxic chemicals that can damage some of the tissues that are in the background shown here. In the next step, we have reception. So after the signal has been secreted or released, um, the target cell has to receive the signal. So the process of receiving the incoming signal is termed reception. You have in the plasma membrane, you have receptors that are large proteins, or they can be large glycoproteins that will receive the signal. These signaling molecules do not actually enter the cell, all right? They do not actually enter the cell. The receptor will communicate with some protein after it receives a particular signal. And in the upcoming slides, we'll see that the signal actually triggers a conformational change for the protein that's embedded in the membrane. And so here, this is just another example of kind of what we saw in the last slide, where we have some immune cell that's present here, and this cell will release a signaling molecule. In this case, it's a cytokine. And then this cytokine or immune signaling molecule will bind to a receptor on the membrane of the target cell. And then it is here where this signal will be converted to an intracellular signal, and it'll be able to signal to activate genes and cause some biological effect. So far, we've gone over uh, signal transmission and reception, and we're going to move to what actually happens once the receptor receives the signal. So when the receptor receives a signal, so as I alluded to earlier, there's some type of change that happens with that receptor. And what will eventually happen is that that signal, that extracellular signal, will be converted to an intracellular signal, and then it'll be relayed to some other proteins in the cell. And so usually this involves a chain of molecules that's shown here. All right, that chain of molecules. So sending that signal through that chain of molecules is often referred to as a cascade effect. All right, a cascade effect or a signaling cascade. And then all of this collectively is referred to or termed signal transduction. Okay, so this is a general animation showing what could happen. And in this animation, We see what happens when the cytokine is released and it binds to a receptor on the plasma membrane. Once the receptor is bound by that signal, it will cause some type of change and initiate a cascade of signaling events that will eventually cause some biological response. All right, so we made it to the actual response. All right, so what is the response? This is when the signal is converted in a way that it's going to alter some cellular process. So sometimes it could be the gene activity, sometimes it could be a metabolic process, and sometimes it can alter membrane permeability. Okay, so in this example, once the signal has been received, it causes some type of change with the receptor, and then that is going to cause a cascade of signaling events or signal transduction process. And in this case, what we see is proteins move into the nucleus, bind to the DNA, and alter gene activity. Okay, and alter gene activity. And so for this learning objective, just to summarize what we've gone over so far, we've described the four main processes essential for cells to communicate. We've discussed or defined cell signaling as it relates to the communication between cells. And we've talked about the four main processes, or given a general overview of the four main processes that are involved in cell signaling. We discussed signal transmission, reception. We've talked about signal transduction, and we've also defined the response.